And I've also had, she talks, like you said, Kelly, you brought up the law school experience and how she had a professor at Harvard tell her that Harvard didn't need any more women. I was in the National Model UN competition in college, and I was flat out told by another contestant that he wouldn't work with me in drafting a resolution because he didn't believe that women should be in leadership positions. So he didn't believe I should be there at all. So when I actually read her talking about how those men in the bar exam told her to go home and get married and that she was going to take their spot, I got really emotional and I started thinking about how, you know, I have been treated in that way too in the 21st century.
I would
Um,
also a similar, nowhere near as perhaps intimidating as trying to take your LSATs with someone telling you, if you take my spot, I'll die in Vietnam. But I was a one-time maybe academic and applying for jobs and in a very specialized field, uh, like ridiculously specialized, which is check culture, which is ridiculous. Um, I don't know what I was thinking about trying to find a job in that. And so you end up knowing pretty much all the people who might potentially apply for those positions.
mhm.
And I remember a male colleague basically saying that I shouldn't apply for the position. Now, he didn't say it because I was a woman, but because he had a family to support. And I don't even know that he knew he was doing it. And I and that the person who he was implying shouldn't apply was a woman. But it was, there were two people who he could have potentially talked to, and I know he only talked to me about it. About wouldn't it be nice if I didn't apply for that job because he needs that job. Uh, and I don't even know if he realized what he was doing. I certainly realized it and just kind of walked away, and I certainly applied for the job. Um, and neither one of us got it, so it was okay, because that's the way those things go. In the same, the similar situation. Where it doesn't, it's not maybe as overt. And my mother as sort of, she's the same age basically as Larry, and going into the profession of being a, a, a minister as a woman, had plenty of these discussions, and so I grew up with those kind of stories of knowing that she never wore a collar. That wasn't part of her denomination as a traditional thing for ministers to do, but she would have to wear a collar if she was going to go visit her members of her congregation in the hospital. Otherwise, they would not tell her what she needed. They wouldn't give her a room number to go see her congregants, because of course she wasn't a minister. That's not a job women have. Uh, and so that kind of, I recognize not just some stories that from my life, but I recognize stories of my mother's life while reading this, and kind of realizing the ways in which those stories have maybe gotten better, but maybe only superficially better rather than actually better.
Well, what's so interesting is, Hillary says she wishes that she could have claimed this story as her own, and that, part of the reason she didn't is because she felt like the country wouldn't have been receptive to it. That, they didn't, that the country wouldn't have wanted to hear this story about how, she sort of came up in the world, in the political world, as somebody shaped by this movement for women's lib. Esther and I were at a talk last week by J.B. Pritzker, who's running for governor in Illinois, where he basically said, one of the things he was highlighting about his personal past is that he was voting, he was marching for women's lib when it wasn't really a thing that people did yet. And, he's claiming that. So he's a white man who's claiming that as part of his personal and political story. And I think it's good that someone is doing it, and I did find it compelling when he talked about it. But, what does that say that a man can say that and a woman can't?
Uh, I I think it says that in one sense that she talks about this in slightly different, Hillary talks about it in slightly different ways in the book, but that we don't want to hear that from women.
Mm-hmm.
And not just, I think this is true of various groups that have been marginalized for various reasons, is we don't want to hear about their suffering or their marginalization from them. We're okay with hearing about, like, we like the story of the underdog. That's an American thing, I think, more than anything. We love a good story of the underdog, but it's way better when it's not really the underdog fighting for the underdog. It's way easier, and it doesn't force us to think our assumptions, and think about how we've been living in the world, well-meaning and well-intentioned as it might be. It doesn't force us to think about that when it's coming from a white man saying, "I was fighting. That sounds great. I was fighting for, I was helping out the little guy."
Mm-hmm.
That's a cool story. It's actually not a great story to be the little guy, so to speak.
So how do we mitigate that in political life? There's a great part where Clinton talks in the chapter on being a woman in politics about how it's sort of like a vicious circle, how studies show that the more successful a man is, the more people like him, but the more successful a woman is, the less people like her. And likability shouldn't be important, but here's the one place where it is. In electoral politics, it's important that people like you. So the more successful women are, the less they're liked, and so the less likely they are to get elected. How do we break that cycle? What do we do about it?
I think we should be in a parliamentary system.
I like that.
For any number of reasons, I'm starting to think that. But, she talks in the book about how women do the work, right? They do sort of like the grunt work in politics. And I think this is largely true. It's an oversimplification, of course, but women, she equates it to doing emotional labor. That women are often the ones in a family who are doing sort of the making the doctor's appointment and making sure that your kids get to the birthday party they're supposed to get to with a present in hand and all of that kind of stuff. And, we see in studies, you can see that it is women who do a lot of this, no matter how their families are set up otherwise. And she says that women do this in politics too, that women are sort of doing the emotional labor for the country. And so, I think that's really interesting that in a parliamentary system where it's the other people working in politics who are choosing their leaders, that women are more likely to rise to the top. In a system like ours that rewards people who are good at campaigning instead of people who are good at governing, they're less likely to rise to the top. I don't think that's a solution, though.
Well, I think that's a really good point, because a lot of more liberal people have been talking about, I guess a lot of more conservative people too, about a third party option. Every 4 years that comes up, people say, "Oh, I'm going to vote for a third party candidate for president." But in between those 4 years, third parties never really get a lot of traction, because our government isn't really set up to take advantage of coalition governments, which is usually what you need in a parliamentary system. So I think that was a really good solution, a really interesting solution.
We'll just change the Constitution. No problem there.
Yeah, it's so easy.
I'm sort of in favor of going through just one election cycle and not letting men vote at all. Just a short term. We had like hundreds of years of not getting to vote. Like, all right, our turn. You go sit down.
That's fair. I like it.
Well, I mean, Hillary talks about how going to Wellesley was so important for her because she had 4 years where she could just, be a leader and not worry about the men.
So does this book change your perception of Hillary Clinton?
I think for me, it crystallizes it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it helps. It reminded me, I think I talked last time about, enjoying her kind of parenthetical, kind of sly remarks. So it was a good reminder that she's funny, I don't think that was something I didn't know. I mean, anybody who's ever heard her really laugh knows that she has a good, she enjoys a good joke and a good sense of humor. So it was a good reminder of that, but it crystallized what I think are her best and in some cases her I don't want to say worst, but her less good aspects.
Yeah, for me, I don't think it changed a lot of my perception of her personally. I definitely voted for her enthusiastically, campaigned for her enthusiastically, was really looking forward. I thought she'd be a very good president. When I read the book, I had just sort of this striking moment of realizing just how good of a president she would have been, like how incredibly much we lost in losing this opportunity. And that was I think the hardest part. So she was like going into some policy detail, and I just had this like it was like being slapped in the face with a wet towel or something. Like, oh my God, are you kidding? Like, we could have had, and just the juxtaposition of how brilliant, and even when I didn't agree with her, because I don't agree with her on everything, I never did, I never will, and that's fine. But even when I don't agree, the stark difference between her and what we have now is it just that I think that was the thing that ultimately was the most painful for me. Like, what did we do?
Yeah.
Well, because even when you don't agree with her, there's a reason why she thinks the way she does, or why she has a policy position, and maybe it doesn't go as far as you would like, or it's you don't want her to do it at all, or whatever it is. But there's a reason why she thinks that, and which means that you could convince her to do a different thing. And I think that is often considered bad in modern day politics, to change your mind. But anybody who spends that much time learning about the details you can convince them. And I think that's actually the thing I probably lament the most, is the ability to have someone who would actually pay attention as best as she could to what was going on and try and actually make governing choices based on the best available data that she had. I mean, not that I don't necessarily think that wasn't the Obama administration either, but that is the thing that is so clear here is she's kind of settled into her ways and into her thinking. It would take a lot to change her mind, but it doesn't strike you as impossible.
Yeah, I don't think the book changed a lot of how I viewed Hillary, but I think the section where she's talking about being a mother was so heartwarming and so interesting. Like, when you think of Hillary Clinton, the first thing that comes to mind isn't like loving mother, but it was clear in the way that she talked about Chelsea that she feels about Chelsea the way I feel about my kids. And that was just, it was, again, it's sort of the juxtaposition of, like, when I hear Trump talk about his kids, I don't hear that. They're like political tools for him. But, it was, and the way that Hillary talks about, she's sort of saying to new mothers, like, hang in there, you're doing okay. Let someone, hold the baby for a little while so you can go get a shower. And, like, she's been there. How powerful would it be to have someone who has been pregnant, someone who's had a baby, be the person in charge of our country? Like, that alone is such a huge missed opportunity that, I think it didn't change. Like, I had gotten a sense of that from the convention, but it was just really powerful to me. And I think that's the thing that I took away from it more than any that sort of helped me in my view of Hillary.
Yeah, and there was an interview with Louis C.K. on one of the evening shows just before the election, and he talked about how he thinks it's a great idea to have a mom as president. And it got a lot of pushback, and rightfully, because the way he phrased it was a little bit sexist, and he is sort of notoriously kind of has some issues on his own. But when I heard it, I was like, yeah, like, I don't think that somebody's value is dependent upon their being a mother or having children. I certainly don't think a woman's value has, but there is something that for me as a mom, as a professional woman who's like maybe a sort of non-traditional mom in a lot of ways, I'm not a good housekeeper and I'm not a good, like, I don't know, like PTA type. there is something about, like, we've tried a lot of dads and some non-dads and some, like, let's try a mom. And we can